At the tavern, the peasants of the village gathered around the fire, eager to hear stories of the gods. Among them was a young woman named Kira, who was known for her deep devotion to Oriel, the goddess of righteousness, strength, and compassion. As the night wore on, Kira began to speak, her voice soft and melodic. She told a tale of a small village that was plagued by a terrible drought. The crops had withered, and the villagers were slowly starving. The people prayed to Oriel for help, but their prayers seemed to go unanswered. One day, a young girl named Amara had a vision. Oriel had come to her in a dream and told her that the village would be saved if the people worked together and shared what little they had. Amara shared her vision with the others, and they set to work, pooling their resources and helping each other in any way they could. Soon, the rains came, and the drought was broken. The crops grew tall and strong, and the people of the village prospered once more. They knew that it was thanks to Oriel's guidance and their own willingness to work together that they had been saved. Kira's voice trailed off, and the other peasants sat in silence for a moment, contemplating the story. Then, one of them spoke up, thanking Kira for sharing the tale and reminding the others that the goddess was always watching over them. The peasants then raised their glasses and toasted to Oriel, the goddess of righteousness, strength, and compassion, and to Kira, who had reminded them of her wisdom and love.
In the flickering light of the hearth, the old man sat hunched over a mug of ale. His gnarled fingers wrapped tightly around the rough-hewn vessel, and his eyes stared off into the distance as he spoke. It was a dark day, the day the orcs came. We had heard stories, of course, of the raids and the pillaging, but we never thought they would come this far south. But they did, and they came with a fury that was unlike anything we had ever seen. He took a long swallow from his mug, and then continued. We did what we could to prepare. Oriel had always taught us to be strong, to be brave, and to stand up for what was right. So we gathered what weapons we had and we stood our ground. The old man's eyes grew distant again, and his voice took on a faraway quality. The battle was fierce. Orcs poured into our village like a black tide, their howls of fury echoing through the streets. But we fought back with everything we had. We stood shoulder to shoulder, as Oriel had taught us, and we held the line. But it wasn't enough, he continued. The orcs were too many, and they were too strong. They smashed through our defenses like a battering ram, and before we knew it, they were in our homes, killing and destroying everything in their path. The old man's voice grew choked with emotion, and he took another swallow of ale to steady himself. I lost my wife that day. She was always so kind, so gentle. But when the orcs came, she fought like a lion. She took down 3 of them before they finally got her. I can still hear her screams, ringing in my ears like a curse. He fell silent then, lost in his memories, and the other patrons in the tavern grew quiet, sensing the weight of his sorrow. But after a moment, the old man cleared his throat and spoke again. In the end, it was Oriel who saved us. We had all but given up hope when we saw her in the distance, striding towards us with a determination in her step that was both fearsome and beautiful. She fought like a goddess, her sword flashing in the sunlight as she carved her way through the orcs. But it wasn't just her strength that saved us, the old man continued. It was her righteousness, her sense of justice. She didn't just kill the orcs, she held them accountable for their crimes. She made them answer for every life they had taken, every family they had destroyed. And when the battle was over, she made sure that they would never return. The old man's voice trailed off then, and he stared down into his mug, lost in thought. But the other patrons knew that the story wasn't over. They knew that the orcs had left a mark on this old man, one that would never fully heal. And they knew that Oriel had saved more than just a village that day. She had saved a way of life, a belief in righteousness, and a love of freedom that would never be extinguished.
The tavern was filled with raucous laughter and the clink of glasses as the patrons shared stories and drinks. Among them was a merchant, a well-dressed man with a quick wit and a silver tongue. He leaned back in his chair and regaled the crowd with a tale of his recent encounter with an elf. "I was traveling through the woods," the merchant began, "when I stumbled upon the most beautiful elf I had ever seen. She had eyes like emeralds and hair like spun gold. I knew I had to have her." The crowd leaned in, curious to hear more. "I offered her jewels and gold, but she wouldn't have it. I offered her fine clothes and furs, but she wouldn't have that either. Finally, I offered her a night of passion, and she agreed." The crowd roared with laughter, clapping the merchant on the back and encouraging him to continue. "But as we were making our way back to my carriage, I slipped in the mud and fell flat on my face. She laughed and ran off into the night, leaving me there in the muck." The patrons laughed even harder, but the merchant's smile faded as he remembered the humiliation of the moment. May Zoltar's fire burn that elf and her tricks. Only those tree people could be so heartless. The crowd quieted, hearing the slip of the tongue. But soon enough, someone raised a glass and called out a toast.
The tavern was bustling with people from different parts of the kingdom, enjoying their drinks and meals while chatting and exchanging stories. Among them were a merchant and a peasant who got into a heated argument. The peasant, who was a devout follower of Auriel, was outraged at the merchant's story of trying to seduce an elf. He believed that people should only engage in relationships with those who were worthy and equal, and that the merchant's actions were disrespectful to Auriel's teachings of strength and honor. The merchant was taken aback by the peasant's accusations and countered by stating that he was not interested in the elf because of her race or status, but because of her beauty and intelligence. He argued that it was possible for people to appreciate and admire others who were different from them, and that it was not a betrayal of their beliefs. The peasant refused to accept the merchant's explanation and stated that it was not only disrespectful to Auriel, but also to the elf and her people. He argued that the merchant's actions were driven by his own selfish desires and that he was not a true follower of Auriel. The merchant was angered by the peasant's accusations and argued that he had every right to pursue his interests, and that his actions did not harm anyone. He also pointed out that the peasant was no different from him, as he also enjoyed the pleasures of life such as food, drink, and companionship. The argument went back and forth, with both parties unable to see eye to eye. The other patrons of the tavern had taken notice of the argument and were starting to take sides, some supporting the merchant and others supporting the peasant. As the argument escalated, the merchant became increasingly frustrated and finally resorted to a curse only used by followers of Zoltar. The peasant was outraged by the curse and accused the merchant of being a hypocrite for pretending to follow Auriel while resorting to the methods of Zoltar's followers. The argument finally reached a boiling point, and the two men decided to end it before things got out of hand. The merchant apologized for his curse, but stood by his actions and beliefs. The peasant, still angry and unconvinced, walked away from the merchant and joined his fellow followers of Auriel at another table. The incident left a bitter taste in the mouths of both men, and they avoided each other for the rest of the night. However, the argument had sparked a debate among the patrons of the tavern, and many discussions ensued about the merits of pursuing relationships with people from different races and social classes, and whether or not it was compatible with the teachings of Auriel.
The old woman took a deep breath, cleared her throat, and began her story with a somber tone. "Listen here, children. Let me tell you a story about the great drought that happened during my great-grandmother's time. It was a dark and terrible time when the sun beat down mercilessly, and the earth cracked open like old parchment. The patrons of the pub leaned in closer, eagerly waiting for her to continue. Fields that were once lush and green turned brown and withered away. The crops refused to grow, and the rivers ran dry. The once bustling towns and villages fell silent as the people struggled to survive. Many left in search of water and food, but few returned." She paused to take a sip of water before continuing. It was a test of our faith, our devotion to the four gods. People prayed day and night to Oro for rain, to Zoltar for a miracle, and to Oromir for guidance. And vain, oh vain, many turned to her for strength to persevere through this terrible time. The old woman's voice grew louder and more passionate as she continued, but there were those who turned to darker ways. They preyed upon the weak, stealing what little food and water they had left. They worshipped the demons, offering them sacrifices in hopes of ending the drought. They forgot the four gods and turned their backs on their fellow man. The old woman shook her head in disgust, but they were punished, oh yes they were. Oro sent her storms to punish the wicked, to cleanse the land of their sins. Zoltar revealed the hidden sources of water and led the people to them. Oromir showed the way to the promised land, a new home where the people could start anew. And vain, oh vain, she gave the people the strength to fight on and survive through it all. The old woman finished her story, and the patrons of the pub cheered, some even raising their glasses in tribute to the four gods. The old woman smiled and leaned back in her chair, pleased that she had shared the story and reminded them of the power of faith.